Today we welcome Alexander Mercouris. Alexander is a British political analyst who is most famous for hosting with Alex Christoforou the geopolitical show The Duran, which for Leonard and me has been a key source of news during the whole Ukraine conflict. But they also speak about other international affairs, whether it's Israel-Palestine or other things that interest them and interest their viewers. And they've built quite a following on YouTube, Rumble, Rockfin, and a host of platforms. So we're very happy to have Alexander here today. We, being a free speech podcast, we're very interested in all of the international affairs that you and Alex talk about every week, or even more than that, even day, I think sometimes. Particularly when we wanted to ask you what we've been seeing from across the pond in terms of the free speech environment in the UK and Europe. And as you know, there's been a host of trends that we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months, whether it's social media censorship in the UK, police coming to people's doors over tweets and texts that they put out, all the way up to cancellations of elections, invalidations of candidates, like just happened in France with Marine Le Pen. And so it seems that there's a lot happening with free speech in Europe right now. We couldn't think of a better person to ask about, what's happening, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about why you think it's happening and why now. So again, welcome, and we're really glad to have you today.
Well, first of all, can I just say I'm absolutely delighted to come and to be on this program, and I'm really looking forward to having this program and hopefully doing more beyond this one. And I cannot think of a more important subject, because if we are talking about free speech is absolutely essential. If you're going to have democracy, the two go absolutely together. You cannot have democracy without free speech. If free speech is being restricted to the extent that it is being restricted in Europe now, including, of course, in my own country, Britain, then that inevitably is going to impact on the democratic process, and it is going to reduce options that people are provided and information that people are provided, and the entire political process then starts to become distorted, and ultimately people lose control over it. So we could not be talking about a more important subject, in my opinion.
You would agree that democracy depends on an informed public. If we're propagandized and censored, it's not really a democracy, is it?
No, because the public is not informed. The public is not making choices. And by the very nature of the process, if information is being restricted, then somebody is restricting it. And that somebody, whoever they are, must be functioning outside the normal democratic process. Because if they're not, that cannot be done. So already you have gatekeepers who are not subject to the same kind of democratic accountability that you would look for and expect to see in a democracy. And the more this process
is flyover, then, Alexander, let's just start with the UK and head east, right? So we have France, Germany, maybe out to Romania. There may be Ukraine, of course. But what do you see happening with being much closer to it than we are? Let's start with the UK. What are the facts that you're seeing there?
We're seeing a steady trend away from free speech. Now, to be clear, I would say that Britain has always historically been one of the most free speech oriented countries in Europe. Free speech is not as important, has never been as safeguarded in Europe as it has been in the United States. We have no real equivalent to the First Amendment of the Constitution. But Britain does have a long tradition of free speech going back to the 18th century, and it's being eroded. And you can see this happening constantly. So to give an extreme example, several friends of mine are now being detained when they return to Britain at airports, are being told that they are not under arrest, that they're not in fact being detained, and that they have their property taken from them, their computers removed, their information taken out of their computers. They ask why. They're not told the reason why. But in every single case, what is true about them is that they are people who are going out there, mostly on social media, and are providing information and providing free speech. Another friend of mine, who you might know, Craig Murray, who is a British blogger, he has taken to reporting court cases. I personally find his reports very interesting. Some people might not be very happy with the way in which he's reported those cases, but the result is that he has been sent to prison and has served a prison sentence because of the way he reported a particular case in which a friend of his was tried and was eventually acquitted. I'm talking about the Scottish politician Alex Salmond. There's also been clear attempts by the British government to restrict social media questions. There's talk about restricting, for example, certain social media platforms, which are considered, unfriendly, or which the British government has issues with. X being, of course, the most prominent example. There are campaigns to restrict X, and campaigns propagated within the media itself and from the political class. And, well, I provided some examples, but you could provide many more. And this goes hand in hand, just briefly, with a sustained effort by the government itself to shape the dialogue and to control narratives and to provide what it calls information and to exclude information which, it considers or says is unreliable.
Alexander, you were one of the leading lights in trying to get accurate information out there about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine and with the proxy war. The information that you have provided has gone against the official narrative that this war was unprovoked, it was a full-scale invasion. Have you personally experienced any blowback, threats of censorship, actual censorship, threats of other sorts of consequences for your reporting and your courageous reporting?
For the moment, I have to say they've tended to leave me alone. And I'm going to say the reason why: I have a legal background. I fought court cases. I've defended myself successfully. And I think I would probably be a difficult person to take on right from the beginning. Also, I'm sorry to say this, but I have a certain ability to use words in what I consider an evasive way. I'm not proud of it at all, by the way, but I'm able to say things in ways that are more coded and more careful than perhaps others do. I don't like doing it. I don't think one should be put in that position. But even though I've not been directly affected, I have been indirectly affected. So, for example, there have been public meetings or attempts to stage public meetings in London to discuss this conflict, in my opinion, in an objective way. And what happens is the pressure is placed on venues where those meetings are being held. And I've been invited to those venues. And the venues then close the meetings. They don't allow the meetings to proceed. And then it's impossible to find any place to hold the meeting. And in several cases, people have had to apply to places like the Venezuelan or Cuban embassies to hold meetings on their premises. And this is about, discussing the Ukraine war, NATO and its role, and things of that kind. So the pressure is always there. It's constant. It's always there in the background. And I mean, the very fact that I have to use careful language is a strain, and it shows that, I'm under pressure too.
So, Alexander, that's, it seems like that whole thing that you just described in the UK is a little bit of narrative control, right? That someone, and we haven't really said who, wants to put some guardrails around what sort of things can be said or not said. I think the EU Digital Services Act probably falls into that category of narrative control. It's always framed as something that people say that it's going to be a threat to children or, widows, orphans, and puppies, but it ends up being about political issues at the end of the day. But that sort of falls into the narrative control. What about elections? We're seeing, whether you want to talk about the election in Ukraine that was straight out canceled, or the one in Romania that was redone when the results weren't looking good for NATO, I guess. I mean, again, we talk about this in the third person almost, like the election was canceled. but it's never really clear, by whom or why. There's speculation about the Romanian election, but I was thinking about this earlier, that these Western democracies, for the past 20 years, their currency and their legitimacy has been based on the fact that they are indeed democracies where a person has the right to say what they think and to have freedom of thought and action. To cancel an election destroys all that currency. And so it wouldn't be done unless there was something really important that the people who are doing that cancellation feel is worth spending the coin on. Can you tell us a little bit about the election in Romania, what happened there and how it all turned out, and maybe what you think about why that happened?
Well, the thing that happened in Romania was that an individual called Kali Georgescu, with whose views, by the way, I am completely at variance. I mean, he has certain views about Romanian history, which is somebody who has come ultimately from the Balkans. I'm originally from Greece. I disagree with profoundly. And it was other political views, which I also disagree with profoundly. Anyway, it looked as if he was going to win the elections and become president of Romania. And what I think triggered the decision to block him, to prevent him prevent him becoming president of Romania. First, he won the first round. Then the first round was cancelled. The story that it was all done through Russian interference was spread, but no evidence for that was ever provided. People have looked at what evidence was provided, and it is universally agreed that it was very thin. Then he tried to stand again. Then he was prosecuted on very nebulous and difficult to understand charges. Then the Electoral Commission stopped him from standing completely. So eventually he was completely blocked. And then the person who took his place and tried to stand basically on his behalf was a man called George Simeon. You go back into his backstory, to be straightforward, he seems to have even more obnoxious and disturbing opinions, as far as I'm concerned, than Georgescu did. But there's a fundamental difference, which is that Georgescu disagreed profoundly with the foreign policy that Romania, as a part of the European Union, was following. He was by no means a friend of Russia's, but he did not think that Romania's involvement in the Ukraine war was good for Romania. He wanted to end it, and he was calling into question Romania's membership of NATO and conceivably, possibly even the European Union. Now, Simeon, who took his place as the candidate of what is called the far right, actually did not argue any of these points. So that, I think, identifies why he was blocked. There is now this constant desire to keep everybody in Europe on the same page with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. And you're absolutely right in saying that we've never been actually told who made the decision, how it was done, what discussions in private took place. There's widespread assumptions that the European Union itself was involved. We don't know, but we could see through what distinguished him from the person who supposedly took up his cause, why it was ultimately that he was prevented from standing.
I have two questions for you, Alex. First, the situation in Pakistan with Imran Khan, and the things that have come out about sort of, it seems like a very sketchy charges that the United States was somewhat complicit in removing him from being elected. I was wondering if you could comment on that, if that sort of fits in the same mold as Georgescu. And then the second thing that Pat and I talk a lot about, in the United States, you could sort of trace a lot of these foreign policy decisions right back to the military-industrial complex. I mean, the expansion of NATO, there's papers, I know Ben Cohen has talked about this recently, that Lockheed Martin sponsored a lot of the initial lobbying efforts with probably with the help of the other big defense contractors to expand NATO and to lobby Congress to expand NATO, which is tremendously profitable for the U.S. arms industry. Is something like that going on in Europe as well? Is there a belief? Is there people whispering in the the leaders' ears that we're going to make a lot of money. We're going to take this business away from Lockheed Martin. We've got our own defense industry. We can make a lot of money. This can profit. We can sell bonds. I don't know.
It's difficult to say that it's exactly the same because we don't have a military industrial complex in Europe that is as organized and as powerful and as big as the one in the United States. I mean, we remain a very fragmented continent in that respect. So in some individual countries like France, yes, there is a powerful industrial lobby connected to military production. We all know the companies like Dassault, for example, and no doubt they do play a role. But elsewhere, one can't really imagine that it is anything like as great. I think that it is something somewhat different, which is that, to be frank, I think under the Cold War, all sorts of structures were created across the European Union, across Europe, in Britain itself. The Cold War ended, but those structures were preserved. And I think that the political conditions have gradually made them both more powerful and in some ways more insecure. Because, of course, without the Cold War, without the sense that there was a challenge to the Soviet Union, the whole rationale for their existence has come under challenge. So in the United States, Lockheed Martin could play a huge role in promoting NATO and promoting NATO expansion. And that was in itself a very important thing. I mean, it wouldn't have happened. NATO expansion would not have happened because the United States is the key player in this. But within Europe itself, there's interplays of all sorts of other forces. So Britain wanted to expand NATO because it sees NATO very much as its mechanism for maintaining its influence in Europe, because it sees itself or believes itself to be the strongest military power. France wanted to expand NATO because it wanted to forge particular alliances with certain countries in southeastern Europe. Romania, by the way, being one of them. Germany wanted to expand NATO because it doesn't want the Russians close to its borders anymore, and it wants to consolidate Europe more around itself. And various people within the security services, the intelligence services, they all came together and they were united in expanding NATO together. But you're quite right in bringing this up, because the expansion of NATO and the policies that went along with it are central to this issue of attacking free speech. Because what they want to do is to protect this project, if you like, of expanding NATO and the security state in Europe and centralizing Europe as well. And they don't want this to be subjected to proper democratic control and discussion.
So let's turn to populism for a minute, and because we wanted to talk about elections, and so maybe the through line between Le Pen being barred from the next election, what's happening with AfD in Germany, and perhaps Romania, is a fear of populism, for however you might define that term, and it may be, maybe you can talk about how you would define populism, if it's even a valid framework for thinking about things. But what is it about the policies and platforms of those people and those parties that the people in power now find so threatening?
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that this expression populism is very amorphous. It basically speaks of anybody, both from the left and from the right, who challenges this system that we've just been talking about. In Britain, the challenge until very recently came from the left. One of the leaders who was called populist, for example, was Jeremy Corbyn, who was absolutely politically on the left. If you're talking about another political figure in Britain who is regularly called a populist, George Galloway undoubtedly has his roots in the left. So it mustn't be thought of as a left-right thing. In Slovakia, Robert Fico would probably also define himself as left, though some people would dispute that. So it's basically people who challenge and criticize the status, the system, and NATO and what is called the Euro-Atlantic community, which are now seen increasingly as two sides of the same coin, are the things that they are supposed that they are the worry that they're challenging. So if you are like the AfD and you talk about rapprochement with Russia, AfD doesn't, by the way, seek to leave NATO, but they want peace with Russia. But that goes against again the policy of the of the people that we're talking about. If you're going to Germany again, the BSW, Zara Wagenknecht's group, they too want a better relationship with Russia. So they're called populists as well. They're put under immense pressure. In France, it's said of both Jean-Luc Mélenchon on the left, and it is said of Marine Le Pen on the right. Again, they disagree on everything, but on this foreign policy issues, they have similar views, and for that reason, they are both anathema to the establishment that exists today. So this is what to understand. Populism is not a method of political activity or anything of that kind. It is simply a label which is fixed on people who challenge the political class and the set of foreign and geopolitical policies that it is pursuing.
I know Pat probably wants to talk a little bit more about other countries in Europe, but let me just focus for a second on Great Britain. You mentioned the left and Jeremy Corbyn and George Galloway and those leaders who, well, we know what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and how he was kneecapped when he got close to power. I always think of it in terms of the United States. So we have we basically have a duopoly, Democrats and Republicans. Democrats used to be considered a left party, but now it's kind of meaningless because now they're the pro-war party, they're pro-censorship. We don't even really know what they stand for. Is there some comparison with the Labour Party in England? Because when a true left leader rises up, he's kneecapped. We saw the same, with Bernie Sanders when he maybe wasn't such a left leader on foreign policy, but certainly on domestic issues he was, and he was kneecapped. So can you talk a little bit about that? What is with the Labour Party? Is it still a left party, considered a left party, or is that where you would go for left-wing thought?
No, I don't think it's a left party, not by any stretch. I think it has gone through the same process as the Democratic Party, only perhaps even more so. I mean, the Labour Party used to have a very strong left wing, which was anti-war, which supported nuclear disarmament, which believed in radical economic redistribution, which believed in public ownership, which supported the welfare state, and which was anchored in the trade unions. In fact, the Labour Party used to call itself the political wing of the labour movement, of which the greater part was organised labour, in other words, the unions. Now, there is nothing about today's Labour Party that in any way resembles that. And you could say the same about many so-called left-wing parties across Europe. The Green Party in Germany began as an anti-war party, strongly opposed to war, as well as an anti-nuclear party. It now is the most belligerent and pro-war party in Germany. The SPD in Germany also had a very strong left-wing background. It was the party of Karl Marx. It was a Marxist party right up until the 1950s. And now, of course, it is nothing of the sort. It was the party of Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and it supported Ostpolitik, then now it is against all of those things. So something happened. And I think you've put your finger on a very important point, because one of the key differences in Europe today, and I suspect the United States also, is that over the last 30 years, there has been a complete collapse of the European left. The European left, which existed previously, has suddenly and very mysteriously vanished. The parties which were formerly its instruments are no longer that anymore. And any attempt from within those parties, as we saw with the Labour Party in Britain, to revive some aspects of their own left-wing traditions always meet with ferocious resistance, in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, from within the Labour Party itself. Now, this is a huge question as to why this has happened, why we have seen across Europe this collapse of the left. But bear in mind something else. It was the left in Europe, going back to our issue of free speech, which always argued and defended free speech. In Europe, perhaps even more than in the United States, this was an essential aspect because the left represented workers. It represented people at lower end demographics, the sort of people who needed speech to be free in order to be able to assert their rights most effectively. So with the left gone, their main protector and champion that enabled them to fight in defense of free speech has also absented itself.
And so I think at the moment, because of the people in power in Europe and the UK, it's politicians and ideas on the right or on the, I'll call it maybe the populist side, as we just said, that are feeling the brunt of these free speech, anti-free speech efforts. Is it the right now that is the champion of free speech in absolute terms, or is it just that they're the victims of this oppression now, and when they get in power, it'll change to a different way? So similar to what we've seen in the US, where the Trump administration initially was very pro-free speech. And I want to talk about, their position vis-a-vis Europe too, but pro-free speech because they were the censored, but now have a censorship regime of their own that favors the issues they want to suppress. So does the same thing happen in Europe?
Well, I think absolutely. I think the thing to understand is that in the absence of a left, everything now, the whole political debate in Europe is conducted within a framework which 30 years ago would have been considered right. I mean, there is no major party that believes in the kind of social democracy or socialism that I can remember. The socialism of Olof Palme and Tage Erlander in Sweden, or Willy Brandt in Germany, or Clement Attlee and Harold Wilson in Britain, or all sorts of people in France. I mean, that doesn't exist anymore. So that the entire debate today is entirely conducted within a right-wing framework. There are differences. So there are some people on the right who are more sovereigntist, who argue for a more, national, even ethnicist perspective, like the AfD does, for example. There are others who are more libertarian. There are others also who are very happy with the present situation and might call themselves perhaps not so right-wing. But ultimately, when you look at their economic and social policies, they are right-wing. Now, given that the right has never been a defender of free speech in European history at any time, and I'm sorry to be absolutist about this, but this is absolutely true, because remember, politics in Europe is different from what it is in the United States. We have a different history and historical tradition. These people, if they ever come to power, the people who are challenging the system now are almost certainly going to be every bit as intolerant of their opponents as the present setup is, because in the absence of a genuine dialogue and division, a push between right and left, the forces that will preserve free speech are simply not there.
You mentioned the different sort of political tradition in Europe. One of the things from the American perspective is we always think of Europe as a little more socialist. You have a national healthcare system in most European countries, and a safety net that's somewhat much more vigorous than what we have in the United States. It seems, am I correct to say that is being undermined? I read stories about what's happening in the National Health Service in England, and and you could maybe talk about Greece as well. It always seems to me, and this maybe is my imagination, or that I always feel like there's like Wall Street type of bankers whispering in the ears of these politicians that, this will work out if we privatize, we cut off this section of the National Health Service and sell it or privatize it, or the same in Greece, whether they were going to sell the Parthenon. I thought I saw some stories. So am I correct that there is sort of this banker whisper campaign that's talking to leaders that maybe aren't as solid as some of the leaders in the past, or as high quality as some of the leaders in the past, and that they're susceptible to these types of pressures?
Oh, well, yeah, first of all, you're absolutely right. This is absolutely true, and it is happening right across Europe. The Labour Party in Britain, over the last year, since it was elected, has been steadily working to undermine the welfare state here in Britain. It has been cutting away benefits. It's adhering very strongly to fiscal orthodoxies. It's been talking about further privatizations. It's doing exactly the opposite things to the sort of things that a Labour Party might have been expected to do in former times. In Europe, the welfare states that you referred to, the commitment to socialism that you referred to, is a legacy product of the European left. It was the European left parties, which basically got underway from the time of the French Revolution, who basically influenced European society, and who, when they gained power within European society, established these welfare systems. So if we look at Germany, for example, Bismarck created the German welfare state because he was worried about the potential rise of socialism. In Britain, it was the Labour Party almost entirely that created the welfare state. It started to put pressure before the First World War, when it started to emerge, and then it did so very much as a result of the Attlee settlement. So socialism, welfare state, freedom of speech. Now, freedom of speech, if you look at it again, it's very much connected to this movement to empower, protect working people in that kind of way. If you go back to freedom of speech, in Britain, in England, you had the Wilkes case in the 18th century. John Wilkes, journalist who says critical things about the king. He is protected, he is supported by the left. What eventually evolves into the left, the people also he's elected by a working class constituency in Middlesex. You're talking about France, which in European terms is a pioneer in free speech. It was the French Revolution that basically says that, anything that is not prohibited is permitted, and basically starts to move towards a position where free speech is protected. So that by the late 19th century, France had the strongest free speech protections of any European country. So all of these things are taken together, and without them, in a context where, as I say, free speech is being undermined, where it's becoming impossible to work on the left does not exist and cannot operate functionally, inevitably, the legacy institutions bequeathed to us, like the National Health Service in Britain, like the social security systems across Europe, like the systems of mixed economy and public ownership, which were universal in Europe 40, 50 years ago, are being systematically dismantled.
Well, it's interesting that there's an economic imperative to all this, because there's always good money in dismantling things and stripping assets, taking public assets and making them private assets. And we talked a little bit about the military-industrial complex, and which is a privatized arms industry, which hundreds of years ago used to be mainly a public function, and now it's a private function in most of the West. So you see that there's an economic imperative to all this. And so what you're saying is that the free speech is actually, that there's a nexus between asset stripping and speech suppression. And maybe you can't do one without the other. Is that fair?
Well, not to the extent that is happening now. I think there is a nexus in the sense that this attack on these institutions really began in the 1980s, when, as I said, the left still existed. I mean, Margaret Thatcher in Britain not her personally, but the whole movement that is associated with her. I mean, set the process going. If you start privatizing industries, if you start weakening those kind of institutions, if you pass anti-trade union laws, which you did very successfully, by the way, then that opens the way for, as I said, the forces which in Europe have always defended free speech to gradually be undermined. The media as well. Media ownership has become incredibly consolidated in Europe in ways that was inconceivable once upon a time. I've seen this play out in Britain with, say, the rise of the Murdoch organization, which Margaret Thatcher personally facilitated, I should say. So then that leads in turn to situations where free speech becomes less possible, where the narrative is constructed around we must do all of these things in order to improve economic efficiency. This is always justified on the basis of economic efficiency. And of course, then that opens the way for more of this to happen. So gradually, as I said, the whole thing begins to unravel, and we start to see every single part of it picked apart. And you're absolutely right. Ultimately, if you're talking about dismantling welfare states, there are major economic winners from this. Businesses that profit out of it, politicians who get paid by those businesses or sponsored by those businesses. There's ideological imperatives, obviously, also. But ultimately, it is also very much the evolution of the economic system, which benefits certain individuals at the expense of others. So all of these things operate together. And in the absence, as I said, of strong free speech protections, independent institutions, which in Europe, I can't speak to the same extent for the United States, but in Europe were always associated with the left. These processes inevitably gain force, and at the moment they look irresistible.
It's interesting too. We were talking a little bit about the quality of politicians, and you mentioned, an Attlee or you didn't say Willy Brandt, but someone of that vintage who was a real politician who really knew what they were doing and were focused on delivering results to their constituents who were the voters. And they were good at it. They knew what it was a lifetime enterprise that they were involved in. And I believe when they retired fairly poor and died fairly poor. But you see something happen now where, whether it's Tony Blair, whether it's the Clinton family, whoever it is, suddenly politicians retire multimillionaires. I mean, there's a great story of Harry Truman giving an interview after he's the president where he's cutting his own grass in his small yard in Kansas City. That doesn't happen anymore. These people are making fortunes when they leave office. And, you can say that they're only good at mouthing. Like if you read Dominic Cummings, he's constantly pointing out how these people are so ineffectual. And the only thing they're good at is creating slogans that they have no idea how to execute on, which may be true to the extent that the slogans have any bearing on reality. But if you step back and say, well, what are they good at? Well, they're good at privatizing public assets. They're good at fomenting wars. They're good at creating trade deficits that allow certain people to benefit hugely from financialization and other things. So they're good at what they're good at, and they do retire as centimillionaires, many of them. So maybe it's not. Maybe it's sort of short-sighted to say that they're poor politicians. They're just serving a different goal than the people who were doing it, 50 years ago.
Well, they're different politicians because they don't function in the same way in fully democratic politics. In the way that Brandt, Attlee, all of the people that you mentioned, Erlander, Olaf Palme, all of those people used to function. In the absence of proper political conflict, and in democracy, you have to have political conflict. There needs to be debate. There needs to be argument. There needs to be real parties which involve millions of people that they feel deeply connected to and loyal to those parties, and they're able to shape the policies and attitudes of those parties. In the absence of that, inevitably, politics starts to become a profession. And what you ultimately get is a kind of political class develop in which the leaders of the various different parties look very alike to each other. And of course, from their point of view, because they're not really seeking to promote the interests of, millions of people who are their supporters in the kind of way that was true in the middle of the 20th century. What they see ultimately is politics as a mechanism for rising themselves, for improving their own position, for gaining status within their peer group, and of course, alongside that, for acquiring greater wealth, the greater rewards to which they believe themselves entitled. They're not embarrassed about this. This is not a system like it would have been, say, 50 years ago, when, if you left politics rich, people commented about this. People today who are in politics just take it for granted that these are the rewards of being in politics. And they don't understand it when you point out, well, actually, maybe that's not the way that politics should work.
The other thing that we've seen in the United States is to sort of the as Pat was talking about the quality of politicians. One of the things that's disappeared is diplomacy. And when we look back on even leaders that were very flawed leaders like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, they did at least believe in diplomacy and talking to our enemies. But it feels like, and I look at a lot of think tanks that come out of the defense industry just because of my family circumstances. I've sort of been fed a lot of this stuff, and you see these weapons manufacturer funded think tanks, and they're always explaining why we can't talk to these people. Diplomacy is bad for business. Peace treaties are bad for business. It's certainly bad for the war business. Anyway, when we look at Nixon and Reagan, they did at least believe in talking. Nixon talked to the leader of China. Reagan talked to Gorbachev. Are you seeing the same thing? And to go even farther, we've sort of criminalized diplomacy with the whole Russiagate thing, that we can't talk to Putin because you're going to be accused of being a Putin puppet, or and it's really shocking that under Biden, we were shuffling towards nuclear Armageddon. Never picked up the phone to talk to Putin or Lavrov. I'm just wondering whether you see this sort of parallels to that in Europe, and can you explain it?
I mean, there are multiple reasons for this, and we can explore many of them, and no doubt will over various programs. And one of them goes back to the topics that we've been discussing already. If what you have right across the entire political spectrum, right across Europe, in Britain, and all over Europe, is basically a single political class in control, which shares certain views, and where, in order to become a member of that political class, you have to adopt those views, then obviously, by definition, there's not going to be much debate or dialogue. And if you have no debate or dialogue within that community, that the people who come out of that community are not going to be very interested or very good in conducting debate or dialogue with anyone else. You see the way they are acting towards their opponents within Europe. I mean, we talked already about populists, about the way Jeremy Corbyn was treated, the way in Germany the AfD has been treated. Because I may not agree with the AfD, but they are a political force. They're not addressed in that way. Georgescu too. You criticize them, you abuse them, you delegitimize them to the extent that you can. And of course, you do the same at the highest level of diplomacy also, because that is what you're constantly doing. You're constantly doing it domestically, and inevitably, you're going to start doing it externally as well, because you can't talk to Putin as if he was, somebody with whom you conduct diplomacy, because diplomacy isn't something that you have any real experience or understanding any of, because you function within a class where everybody is expected to agree with everybody else.
So it's interesting that one of the things that censors will do, that when they're censoring free speech of various kinds, is say that this person who needs to be censored is fomenting discord. And as you say, democracy is a dialectical process. There's a person on one side, a person on the other side, and through this clash of ideas, some kind of consensus, forms, and that's the dialectic of democracy. But for them, there is no dialectic. It's you have to steamroll your opponent. There's, I think, sort of thought tools, right, that people use to do that. Whether it's we talked a little bit about public-private partnerships. Well, everybody thinks they know that public-private that the private sector is quote unquote more efficient than the public sector and therefore can do things more cheaply. But it's demonstrably false because their cost of capital is higher. No one can issue bonds at the rates that governments can issue bonds. So their capital is higher and there's going to higher charge for using it. That's just very simple. But that's a thought tool to say private sector is efficient. And everyone agrees on that. And that becomes part of the boundaries of what's discussable or not discussable. And if you say what I just said, you'll be considered some sort of outlier. But it's epistemologically true. Cost of private capital is higher than the cost of government capital. But it's true on all kinds of things. That diplomacy means that you're weak and that you're talking to enemies and that you're Neville Chamberlain. There's sort of a intellectual framework in this sort of politics that has to be accepted before you enter the game. And then there's no real discussion after that. There can't be.
Well, absolutely. There's even a language. I mean, in Britain, you can see it. I mean, politicians speak in a language which is very, very different now from the way they used to speak 50 years ago. I mean, and that kind of debate and discussion that you say. I like very much your description, by the way, of politics, democratic politics as a dialectic process, which is absolutely what they do not want to see happen anymore. And of course, if you are not talking within that kind of process, if you're not talking straightforwardly, if you're not talking to people, to the mass of the electorate, as you once did, you are addressing members of your own class, and you are using the same language as the other members of that class, all these various memes and things that you said, because it's a signal to the members of the class to which you belong that you do actually belong to them. If you come along and say, well, maybe we should reconsider whether private industry really is that more efficient than public industry. By the way, I've worked in both, and I completely agree with what you said. My experience is the public is actually more efficient than private, and I can talk about that at great length. But anyway, certainly in legal work it is. But anyway, certainly if we're talking about big law firms and whatever, but that's a topic for another day. But if you say that, if you come out and say that, then you are engaging in a heresy, and that means that you cannot be part of the group and cannot participate in it. Now, the Russians during the Soviet era had an expression for this. They spoke about using Aesopian language, that within the apparatus, everybody used what was called Aesopian language. A language of memes and cliches which everybody understood. And this is what we are looking at today. And the problem is, of course, that is completely incompatible with free speech by definition, and with democratic politics as we have always understood them.
Well, it's really interesting that that's happening at a time, again, where the people who say democracy under threat are the people who are threatening democracy by constraining the boundaries of thought such that you can't argue without being a heretic. And it's interesting too, when we talk about censorship, we didn't talk about this too much, but I think we've talked about it in the past off camera, but the social aspect of it, that when you express a view that's not one of these kind of catechistic ways of saying things, you become a heretic in the eyes of whoever you're speaking to. It's not there's not really a social environment for exchanging views, maybe the way there was in the days of what Leonard was talking about, shuttle diplomacy, when people maybe discussed ideas in a more pure way. Now it's either you're speaking the language of the catechism, or you're a heretic. And if you're a heretic, then you're sowing discord. You're a shill for Putin, et cetera, et cetera. And that may be the democratic environment that we're in, which leads to the free speech environment we're in.
Well, indeed. And in fact, we do indeed need certainly to talk about the mechanisms of censorship which exist today in the West, because they're very difficult to understand. And we don't have a censorship bureau like they say had in the Soviet Union, where there was, whole categories of people who were there to make sure that censorship functioned.
Well, we may in the U.S. We may in the U.S.
Mike in the U.S.
done a lot of work about how this all worked in the U.S. and it's extremely complicated, but it seemed to be a true censorship bureau. But anyway,
yeah.
but I take.
But can I just say something? We've never had, perhaps it's fair to say, the same kind of examination of that in Europe, and we've had no book like establishing consent, or whatever it was, the Chomsky Herman book. There's never been anything like that I'm aware of.
Or the Twitter files from Matt Taibbi that exposed a lot of government hand in censorship.
In Europe, there's never been anything quite like that
Right.
that's happened recently in Europe. So we don't know exactly how it functions, but one can see it work. We can see how it works. One can see how, for example, all the newspapers carry almost identical editorials on a particular day, on a particular subject, identical to the point where sometimes they even use the same turns of phrase. I mean, it's very strange. And we also see how certain stories are covered and other stories are not covered. And one wonders exactly how it happens. Now, a couple of years, about 15 years ago, somebody who was in contact with me informed me that, in fact, the foreign editors of the big newspapers in London have meetings every Tuesday with MI6. Is it true? Is it not true? I've never been able to establish it. I mean, nobody's ever confirmed it. An article to that effect then appeared in The Independent, which is a newspaper that we have in Britain. Probably, if you go and look in the archives, you will find it, but you will certainly not find it on the internet anywhere. So, exactly how the mechanisms of censorship work certainly in Britain is a very, very good question. And the only thing I would say is that they do exist and they are pervasive. And coming back to the point that you were making, it has to also be said that there is a certain level of popular support for it too. There is a great deal of success in stirring up people and enlisting them in order to attack those who go out and act as dissidents and question, established orthodoxies. So this is a very complicated and interesting topic, which requires an awful lot more study. And as I think I said at the start of the program, I don't have all the answers. I can just see the phenomenon without always being able to explain exactly the machinery with which it works. But that it does exist, of that there is no question.
You can see it. I don't know if you've ever seen those mashups, but I think there's a guy in the U.S. called Matt Orfalia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but who does a great one. Since you're following Ukraine closely, he does one. If you just look up "not about Ukraine," and all of the talking heads in the U.S. are saying the exact same words, just like as you say, the exact same phrases on the exact same day about this topic. So there's you feel something going on, just like maybe a Soviet citizen would know, whether they knew there was a censorship bureau or not. Hey, something's happening here. Why are we all seeing the same words over and over again all the time? But so before we wrap up, maybe we should ask one more question. We always like to end on a positive note if we can. So, it seems like it's dark times for freedom of expression around the world. And maybe the new administration in the US will find its footing. They seem to at first, and then, they seem to be going down a rabbit hole now with respect to the expression about the Middle East. But how do you see things ever getting better in Europe and the UK? Is it just you sort of alluded to the fact that it's not just a change of political party that's going to make a difference here. How do people get the right to share ideas and freely express what they are thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this system is unsustainable. I mean, somebody once said that when change looks impossible, it becomes inevitable. And I think it is unsustainable and change is inevitable. I am not sure of what the exact mechanics, how that change is going to be brought about. But I will say this. I look at the fact that every day I speak for an hour and a half and I attract 100,000 views. Now that speaks for something. It does mean that there are people out there who do sense that there is something wrong. And I'm just one person and not even the most important person. There are many others, people who go out and talk and find audiences and are able to speak. So I think that sooner or later, in some way, this thing is going to change and we will probably find our way back to a more real politics again. And when that happens, we will have a more democratic politics again. It's important to remember democracy hasn't existed always. I mean, before that, there was, monarchical systems and people rebelled against them and changed them. So, it may be that this is what will happen. The question is how soon and how long this process is going to take and how bad things are going to become in the meantime. I think in Britain, strangely enough, we might be past the worst in the sense that the political system here is very discredited. The main political parties look exhausted. There is immense criticism and hostility to them. There is no alternative. I mean, Farageism is no kind of alternative to this. But the very fact that he is as prominent as he is, and he gets support from all kinds of different people for completely different reasons, by the way. There's no single reason that explains it, but it is a sign of disaffection and rebellion against the system. In other parts of Europe, I'm afraid things are going to go on getting darker, at least for a while. How this changes altogether, I'm not really able to say, but change it will. Of course it will. And it will change in Europe and it will change in the United States.
If I could just follow up on the last question on the topic of optimism. One of the things we do, Pat and I, is try to support independent media. And one of the reasons why is because of and one of the reasons why you have a show where you're providing credible information to 100,000 people every day is because of the collapse of the mainstream media. I know The Guardian used to be a well-respected paper. The New York Times was a well-respected paper, the Washington Post. And we've seen just a collapse in trust in that, which is probably gave you a lane or maybe motivated you to come forward and say, I've got to try to get some credible information out because it's important for democracy. But
100,000 is twice the size of many CNN shows.
Yeah.
So
there you are.
Yeah, I'm just wondering the collapse in the mainstream media and the rise of independent voices, and maybe that's a good thing that there is. That maybe that's something that the internet has allowed us to reach smart people, well-informed people to actually reach. And the one other thing I just want to mention about what we've seen in this country, it's not only bad information coming from the New York Times, but we've actually seen a transition to directly misleading people. And the Ukraine war is a great example. I mean, Biden came out within hours of the invasion in 2020, the February 2022, and said this was unprovoked. This was a full-scale invasion. And every single newspaper, every story that you read in the New York Times for 2 years has to use the word unprovoked. Everyone knows it's not
brutal and unprovoked. Those two words. I mean, they're talking points emanating from somewhere. Again, you can see all the mashups. They're being instructed somehow to say these things. There's no question. These things don't happen by accident.
No,
right?
they don't.
So,
I agree. I think there's something else which is actually very important, because you're absolutely right, by the way. And I mean, technology is evolving, and it is very difficult to control it. It does enable people like me to reach out, and you're absolutely right in saying that that media, the legacy, the media that we've always worked with and known about, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Le Monde, El País, they don't have the kind of credibility and traction that they once did. But another point to say, and it's a very important one actually, is that it is essential not to underestimate. It's a mistake that political classes often make, underestimate the political intelligence of the majority of people at any one particular time. I have consistently found that, irrespective of the demographic you are addressing, if you manage to interest people in a topic, they understand it and are remarkably shrewd about it and become capable of understanding it very, very quickly. And I think that is a mistake that the political class also makes. So they are manipulative, but they are visibly so. And this is something that people sense and people see, and that helps to discredit them even further. People like myself try not to be manipulative, and I think people understand that and appreciate it.
well, that's great. We appreciate all you do, Alexander, and Alex as well. I wish he could be here as well. Maybe someday we can get all four of us together.
That would be fantastic.
But we really appreciate your time today in talking with us. It was a great conversation, and we would love to have you back. So thanks again for everything. And again, I mentioned in the beginning of the show, Alexander Mercouris, where can we find you?
Well, you can find me on the Duran, which is a YouTube channel, and you can also find me on my own channel, which is Alexander Mercouris. You just type that into YouTube, and I will come up, and you will see me there, and you can listen to what I have to say. And thank you again for inviting me on a wonderful program today. And I very, very much do hope that we do more.